Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest, and my guest today is Senator Tim Kaine. Senator, can you tell me about your bill on the authorization of the use of military force abroad and how you want to change the way American presidents go to war?
Jacob, I'm glad to, and thank you for doing this interview. I'm very focused on this kind of fundamental question: how do we make a decision in the United States to engage in military action? And the history shows we're all over the map. Presidents tend to overreach and act without Congress when they think they can get away with it. And members of Congress often abdicate and would rather not vote if they can avoid it. And so the original constitutional vision that we would not initiate war absent a declaration by Congress has largely been, ignored for 230 plus years. The bill that I have introduced with Senator McCain, the War Powers Consultation Act of 2014, basically does three things. It first tries to define what is a war that should trigger the need for congressional approval. Now, this is a more complicated question than you might think, but back in the day, wars were nation against nation, but now we have non-national international terrorist groups. Is a cyber attack war, is a drone attack war. There's all kinds of variations on this question. Functionally, the way we describe it in the bill is a war would be any use of American military troops in combat in another country for more than 7 days. That's the first thing we do. Second, we tackle the problem of what does it mean for a president and a Congress to consult. You'll hear a president say, well, I consulted with Congress about this. But you don't know if that means with relevant committee chairs, with two senators that the president knew was going to be friendly and say yes. There is no real meaning to the phrase consult with Congress. So the second thing the bill does is create a permanent consultation committee, bipartisan and bicameral, 20 members. That committee would have a permanent staff and would be in just consistent dialogue with the administration about security challenges around the globe. And if any of those challenges required military action, that consultation would already be taking place. The third thing the bill does is if it is in fact a war that meets the definitions, the more than 7 days of combat, there is a requirement that Congress cast a vote, that a vote be cast in both houses. And the purpose of that is obviously that I think the elected representatives of both houses should have to be on the board, yay or nay, on whether we go to war. That's consistent with it is Congress's power to declare war. And ultimately for me, this is about finding a consensus that we shouldn't be asking servicemen and women to risk their lives if the executive and legislature haven't reached a consensus that this military mission is worth it.
But one of the things that we've seen over the past couple decades is the steady rise of the imperial presidency.
Indeed.
And the powers keep getting greater, and I guess the greatest exponent of it actually was Dick Cheney, the doctrine that the president can pretty much do whatever he wants in foreign policy. Does President Obama look at you with horror when you mention this idea, or does he say, maybe it's a good idea?
I've talked to the president and his team about this, and you're right, the imperial presidency is a reality, although it's interesting, it's not even just been in the last couple of decades. When the Constitution was written, as it was written, James Madison said, our Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrate, that the executive is most interested in war and therefore most prone to it. For this reason, we assign questions of war to the legislature. So the notion that an executive would be imperial, monarchical at that time, and would overreach was something that the framers of the Constitution understood. The president and his team understand that the last 13 years have shown a lot of weaknesses in the processes around how we make these decisions. And while they don't look at it through legislative eyes, they look at it through executive eyes, and they don't want to have their hands tied too tightly. I think they do understand that a more normal process for consultation and decision making would be in the national interest. They may have slightly different views about some of the definitional questions than we would, or what some of those processes would be. But in my discussions with the administration, they haven't said, don't pursue this. To the contrary, they've said, that's a worthy effort. We'd like to work with you on it. And so we are working with them on, as we try to find our way to a solution.
If you look at a public opinion polls, if they're reliable and trustworthy, they would suggest that the reputation of Congress is at an all-time nadir.
It is. Yeah.
Why is it a good idea to enmesh the legislative branch further in these kinds of decisions? Do you think it would actually work? Or would it be a recipe for paralysis?
You know, so a number of answers to that. First, we should be enmeshed because it's what the framers intended. We haven't changed the Constitution. As I've said, the underlying value of the way the decision-making structure was set up was we shouldn't be making servicemen and women risk their lives if there's not a political consensus that the mission is worth it. So if you let the president, one person is fallible. If you let the president just make the decision without Congress, you're less likely going to have, I think, a decision that is a wise decision than one that involves a consensus between a president and Congress. If you don't engage Congress in the decision, you're less likely to have a debate that will educate the public about what's at stake. So we need to do it to find the consensus. And then finally, Congress is viewed in low repute. So you could ask, why get Congress involved? But I'd ask, why is Congress viewed in low repute? I think Congress is viewed in low repute for a number of reasons, but one is a tendency to kick issues aside, not take issues seriously, try to duck responsibility when they can. You know, don't do budgets years and years and years in a row. Not doing the job that is a defined part of the job description, especially one of the most important parts. I think that's one of the reasons why Congress's approval is low. So we need to get back to doing the things that Congress is supposed to do. And certainly none is more important than weighing in on whether or not we should engage in military activity.
Last question. About a little over a year ago, Jim Webb wrote a cover story for our magazine in the National Interest, calling pretty much for exactly what you are, that the legislature has abdicated its role in foreign policy. Mm-hmm. So my question for you is personal. Is it because you're from Virginia and with a big military presence there? Is this what's animating you, or is it something more personal?
You know, a little bit of both. And I would say Jim, the article that he wrote for you about that was a very powerful one. And I think it's hard to argue with his proposition. And in fact, since that article was written, I hear members all the time talking about, well, you know, why be on foreign relations? That's not a good way to get votes back at the home front, you know. So I think the number of senators, you see senators like Dick Lugar who were really focused on foreign relations issues. They lose elections and people say, well, maybe that's because he was focusing too much on the globe and not enough with the state. So I think there's some political pressures that are moving senators away from a focus on these issues. The good news is in Virginia, we are incredibly connected to the nation's military mission. Our history, Yorktown, Appomattox, the Pentagon, where 9/11 happened, our people, 1 in 9 of us is a veteran. We have active duty, Guard and Reserve, you know, shipbuilders. One of my kids is in the military, and that's not unusual for Virginians. So we're really connected to it, but we're also connected to the foreign policy mission. You know, those who established Virginia it was a foreign policy endeavor by the Virginia Company, chartered by King James, to go out and find new opportunities for global expansion. Those were the folks who settled Jamestown Island in 1607. I also lived in Central America when I was a young man 30 years ago, and the experience of living abroad made me really appreciate both things I took for granted here, but also the critical and important role that the United States can play as part of the global community. And I think many Virginians have that experience. So I think engagement on military issues, engagement on foreign policy issues is not sort of contrary to what my constituents want. I see my constituents feeling the same way about the important role that America plays in world affairs. And our role will be different in the 21st century than the 20th. It can be equally a role of powerful leadership, but we won't define it the same way because the challenges and issues will be different. But we want to play that role, and Virginians get that.
Well, Senator, thanks for a great interview and good luck with your bill.
Great, thank you. Thank you.